On a first ever edition of a China Talk emergency podcast, Samuel Hammond of the Niskanen Center joins us to talk about the latest developments of the Endless Frontier Act. So, Sam, what was the dream circa a week ago of the Endless Frontier Act?
Well, it has been changing steadily, and I think a lot of people actually expected some of these changes. The Endless Frontier Act was originally introduced by Chuck Schumer and Todd Young last year. It really grew out of even earlier conversations with Mike Gallagher on the House side, others interested in doing something big to spur U.S. support for research and development and science, sometimes framed in the context of a technology arms race with China, sometimes just for technology's sake. But I think it is notable that in its original form, it was very driven by national security staff within the Senate, staff who don't necessarily have the background or are part of sort of the academic research establishment. So they came at it with a sort of fresh set of eyes, and their approach was to say, well, there are these 10 areas. The areas are somewhat arbitrary and broad, things like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, advanced manufacturing, material sciences, advanced energy research,
Chips.
Chips, methods of mitigating climate change. There are a bunch of very big issues that need a lot of dedicated attention. We can't necessarily micromanage our way to solutions in any of these areas, but what we can do is create a new organization. So the original idea was to create a new technology directorate at the National Science Foundation with a specifically tech and applications focused mission to have sort of a civilian DARPA, if you will, with the same program authorities, same sort of flexible hiring and grant making ability to take a huge pot of money, so originally $100 billion, and over 5 years, put that money to use in growing American technological capabilities in those 10 different areas.
So that sounds really cool. Sam, why do you sound depressed?
I sound depressed because good things don't last forever. So last week, the bill was progressing, and as many people expected it to progress because Majority Leader Chuck Schumer was an original sponsor of the Endless Frontier Act. It progressed through the U.S. Senate Commerce Committee for markup, which is an opportunity for everyone to get their piece of the pie. And honestly, that stuff is expected and sort of part of the normal way of doing business in Congress, and it's totally fine. Anytime there's a big piece of legislation, especially one that people think will pass, members will try to get their thing attached to it. And there's nothing wrong with that. But what surprised a lot of people and surprised me is that people weren't just adding things to the proposal, but at one point, Senator Cantwell, who chairs the committee, sponsored first a substitution amendment, and this is an amendment that basically substitutes funding for one thing and switches it to another, that took away a huge chunk of the directorate's funding. Then there was another amendment from Senator Lujan from New Mexico that required the directorate to divert most of a substantial amount of its funding through the national labs. So instead of creating a new thing, channeling that money through existing national labs, of course, obviously New Mexico has several national labs. And by the end of it, over that 5-year period, instead of getting $100 billion, the technology directorate now gets $29 billion, of which only about 4.5 is discretionary. So the rest is for scholarships, for academic tech transfer, diverted back to the NSF, et cetera. So instead of having this big sort of autonomous DARPA-like organization with a lot of resources to move nimbly and flexibly, we now have basically what is turning into a kind of like tech subdivision of NSF.
Which has some resources and can do some cool things. I guess what is it? You did the math and it was something like $300 million in the first year, going up to $3 billion maybe by 2026. We'll see how much ends up getting appropriated. But still, this is very different from the scale, which it seemed like there was some consensus on in Congress for spending a few orders of magnitude more, specifically on this push toward applied research as opposed to the more basic stuff, which the national labs and sort of big science, mainline NSF is likely to, would be doing otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, America has always had a lot of leadership in basic research and science, and obviously our academic research is world class. But where we've not excelled is, translating that research into scaled production, especially scaled domestic production. And that's something that is particularly relevant in the context of sort of this perceived or real technology race with China or other countries, which is that we can do the designs, we can do the basic research, but once that paper is published in the archive or wherever, it becomes public knowledge. Whether or not it's public domain, it becomes public knowledge. And so and that's actually the argument for funding basic research, is that it has these positive spillovers. But the positive spillovers spill over everywhere, right? And so if you really want to secure technological leadership and not just be able to say that you invented the thing, you have to transfer that technology into actual tangible production. And that requires real resources, right? It requires real resources to scale. In my piece, I talk about the solar panel industry as an example. I'm sure that DOE funded many of the breakthroughs that led to more efficient photovoltaic cells and stuff like that. But what really turned the page on solar and led to massive drops in cost was Germany and China pouring a bunch of money into scaling up production.
Yeah. And to be clear, inventing the thing gives you a head start. It gives you the sort of talent pool of those graduate students and professors who came up with this stuff in the first place and who are probably most well positioned to take that and refine it and scale it and bring it into the market. But that chain, which I have a series of podcasts coming out in the next week or two, exploring in more detail, has some missing links to it. And the hope was that Endless Frontier was going to be able to address that, and it seems like that's not necessarily what's going to happen. The House version of this bill doesn't even have a tech initiative, and is basically like entirely a little like it's smaller scale, and then basically just like giving NSF money to increase its budget. And I think what was the line? We went from like what's our final dollar amount change?
These specific things less than 10 billion over 5 years.
Yeah.
There's more money that goes to scholarships. NSF, their budget will go up by, I forget the exact number of probably 3 or 4 billion, something on that magnitude. But they have a bunch of that money gets earmarked for STEM workforce development.
Yeah.
So none of this stuff is really useless, right? A lot of the stuff passes even the strictest cost benefit test, right? Because R&D is just that useful, and STEM education is useful, scholarships are useful, but there's a qualitative difference between sort of tinkering around the margins and doing real institutional evolution, right? And my argument is that longer run, if China does have an edge in anything, it's not financial resources, it's not STEM degrees, it's the ability to adapt their institutions. And what I mean by that is, if we look back at U.S. history, whether it's the creation of the national labs or the creation of MIT and the land grants that established a lot of our research universities, like we went through periods of real institutional rebirth where we created new organizations with new cultures and new missions. And today we're living really with the vestiges of, in the case of NSF and a lot of these science agencies from the 1940s, right? And that's not bad, but even private businesses become kind of complacent and sclerotic over time and need to be, Ford or General Motors need to face competition from Tesla or what have you. And government institutions don't have that natural ability for competitors just to merge out of nowhere. You have to, and actually this is another interesting thing, one of the things people underrate about China is the extent to which they build redundancies and then make those redundant organizations compete with one another, right? Even their provinces and lower units of government, like they're competing with each other in a way that creates a degree of dynamism that the U.S. institutions just lack. And I finished my piece with the story of Vannevar Bush walking into President Roosevelt's office with a single sheet of paper describing the National Research Defense Council. And President Roosevelt approved it within 10 minutes. And that research council, it didn't last that long, but it helped seed the Manhattan Project. It helped seed some of the research behind sonar and radar. So like if there's any long run risk that the U.S. faces, whether against China or against another pandemic, the Department of Defense took over a year to create their own mask, right, for COVID-19. That signifies a degree of institutional lock-in. And one of the bright spots of the Inland Frontier Act was, hey, we're actually going to make something new. And actually, it might sound like it costs a lot of money, but $100 billion over 5 years after we just spent a year sending out, $400 billion stimulus checks every 3 or 4 months. It seems like a smart use of funding. So
should people call their congressman? What's the call to action, Sam, for the Endless Frontier Act, of which it seems like one journalist is actually following and only 5 people, 2 of which include me and you on Twitter, care about?
I think there's still a chance for something to change because, by far the biggest hit was the amount of money they're getting, and those appropriations could change. But I do think the longer run, the issue, the phone calls coming from inside the house in some sense, right? So, the National Science Foundation itself doesn't want to be overshadowed, and maybe one of the mistakes was tying this so closely to the NSF rather than just doing something discreet. But there's no turning back on that at this point. You can try calling your congressman, but the politics are so pedestrian. It's not like people don't care. It's that Ben Ray Lujan has national labs in his state, right? And he's not going, and he's doing his job, right? And I think the bigger thing is why do it at the expense of doing something new and innovative rather than doing both, particularly when we know that these are sort of long-term investments that pay for themselves in spades, where the SBA has a program for this summer. They're going to be giving out $16 billion in grants to entertainment venues like South by Southwest that were hurt by the pandemic. That's $16 billion for festivals and stuff like that. It's going to be a wild. It's going to be a wild time. But
I love jazz. I love jazz. I love jazz bars, but I would really love a sort of future AR virtual reality, which really works, that the NSF makes, allowing me to go to any jazz bar in the world anytime I want to. And those $16 billion are not going to get me any closer to that future.
Exactly.
So, the whole idea of building it within the NSF, I think it was a mistake from the beginning, because, once you have the sort of expertise that gets related to when you do that sort of thing are former NSF directors. And all of them are dedicated to the idea of mostly academic-driven basic research. And they saw this and they're like, what the fuck? Which again is understandable, given that this is the institution to which they've devoted their lives to, and change is scary. And I guess, talking to Hill staffers, the idea of it just being too hard and too complicated to set up something new is a bummer. And look, I think your characterization of China is I can certainly complicate it. There are downsides to having lots of different organizations doing the same thing in terms of waste and debt and inefficiency. But at the same time, one of the best performing little corners of the U.S. government is the Consumer Protection Bureau, which was founded 2009? Right. And when you start something from scratch, you can design it in a way in which is made for the time and the moment. And you can hire an entirely new crop of folks who are mission driven, and that freedom just really doesn't exist in current bureaucracies as they exist. And taking scalpels to current bureaucracies are really hard, because there are a lot of vested interests who are vested, again, not for bad reasons. This is not like the sugar lobby, right? Asking for subsidies for farmers. These are scientists who are trying to make the future. But at the same time, it's just come on, guys, have a little imagination. This is how cool could this have been?
Right. If there is any chance of this coming back, I think it will have to be from folks in national security really making a point to say this goes beyond science and academia. We're trying to do something important here, and maybe not everyone understands the full context.
Sam Hammond, thanks so much for being a part of this emergency edition of Chinatown.
慰めてたまらす音色